It is the 1590s, and we are in England. And we're at the tail end of the reign of Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth has gone on in history as one of the greatest monarchs in English history. And there are a lot of reasons why people think this, but two of the most important are that she ruled for over 40 years, and that she presided over one of the most important cultural expansions in the entirety of English history. It's during Elizabeth's reign that Shakespeare comes on the scene, and though Shakespeare today is perhaps the best known at the popular level in terms of English literature, this was really a flowering of the use of the English language in the arts. And it is in part for her presiding over this period of history that Elizabeth has gone down with the nickname Gloriana, the glorious one. Well, in the 1590s, Elizabeth has been reigning for over 30 years. At this point, it is clear that she will not marry, and given that she's now in her 60s, of course, it is obvious that she will not have any children, and therefore she will be the last of the Tudor dynasty. And the 1590s were something of a tense time for Elizabeth. There was a certain amount of pressure in the system in England at this time, as throughout the continent the so-called wars of religion were in full effect. Henry IV of France, for example, needed money for the civil war that he was fighting on behalf of Protestants and on behalf of the Huguenots. And to her eternal frustration, Elizabeth herself personally committed over 300,000 in currency over 4 years in order to help support Henry IV's effort to take the French throne. She sells off lands and begins to contribute to this amount, but in the end, Parliament balked, and they reduced the amount and asked that it be only 2/3. A move that both embarrassed the Queen and stalled her efforts to support the Protestant movement in France. Also, by 1593, 6 of her most intimate and crucial supporters within government had passed away. So here we have Elizabeth, in her 60s, having lost allies and having suffered a little bit of setback with Parliament, who was in need of some comfort. And though most people forget this, Elizabeth was actually extraordinarily well educated. During her years as Henry VIII's daughter, when she was third in line, several important humanists had trained her in languages, history, and all of the humanities that had flourished during the Renaissance. Historians actually know that Elizabeth was quite precocious in all of her subjects. She was very good in particular at languages. And so here in the 1590s, at the age of 60, Elizabeth sits down to translate into English, both in an effort to exercise her muscles intellectually as well as to perhaps learn a few things about the trials of political office. Elizabeth turned to an incredibly important text from the early Middle Ages, and she translated it in a matter of 6 or 7 weeks. Now, she didn't intend this for publication. She really didn't even intend this to be something that was publicly known. Elizabeth, in her old age, is reliving some of the glories of her youth, some of the educational glories that she experienced. And the book she turns to is The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. And this text is incredibly important because it not only signaled one of the more important discussions of what became known as scholastic engagement with God, time, foreknowledge, and God's sovereignty over evil things as well as good things. But Boethius, when he wrote the text Consolation of Philosophy, was himself in prison, put there by Theodoric, the ruler of the western half of the Roman Empire, and a man whom Boethius, just a matter of months before, had served as consul, as his right-hand man in the state. Only Theodoric had turned on him, thrown him into prison. He'd been charged with conspiracy of trying to incur the good favor of the Eastern government in an effort to bring East and West back together, thus overthrowing Theodoric. And so Boethius's book is incredibly passionate. Here's a man sitting in prison, awaiting his death, and he turns to his intellectual and philosophical side to make sense of all of this trauma in his life. And so, for whatever reason, Elizabeth turned to this text, both to comfort herself as well as to engage personally with a piece of her past when she was being trained by the humanists as a young girl. And Elizabeth's translation is important, not only because it's a translation by a queen, but because we have so little in terms of output by women during the Renaissance. But more importantly, Elizabeth knew her history, And she knew the importance of the constellation of philosophy, and she knew the importance of Boethius as a thinker, as really the father of medieval scholasticism. And so in this lecture, we're going to look at Boethius and the beginnings of the dawn of the intellectual wing of the Middle Ages. Because as we'll see, in many ways, if it were not for Boethius, all that comes after in terms of the intellectual formation of medieval Europe would have either looked drastically different or it would not have developed at all. Well, who was Boethius? Boethius was born in Rome, and he was part of the Anicia family. And the Anicia family is one of the more important families in the history of the Roman Empire. They were an ancient family with multiple branches sort of shooting out in different directions. And it seems as if the family was the first, or at least one of the first, amongst the senatorial ranks to actually accept Christianity after the Constantine Revolution. They transferred their allegiance from Maxentius to Constantine, and they were deep lovers of the faith. They also, however, were instrumental and fierce defenders of the ongoing separation of the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. They, being part of the West, strove incessantly to make sure that the West had its own autonomy in a manner of speaking. And often this meant that they served right alongside emperors or rulers in the western part of the empire and worked to enact policies that ensure the success of the Western Empire. And so Boethius comes from a privileged line. His father was Flavius, and he had served as consul in 47 after the rise of Odoacer in the West, and had done his work with distinction. In just the way politics worked in this day, to come from a strong senatorial family like this meant that you as the son were often destined to the same profession. And that's exactly what Boethius does. By the age of 25, in fact, Boethius himself was a senator. And over the course of the early 500s, Boethius served in a number of capacities as the right-hand man of a number of important rising figures in the Western world. This is the time of Clovis and the Franks, flowing out of the Merovingian dynasties, etc., sort of rising up on the tide in the western half of the empire. Only Boethius serves primarily in the Ostrogothic kingdoms, located around the rim of the Mediterranean, in the southern part of modern France and in the northern part of the Spanish mountains. And in fact, by 510, Boethius himself is consul. Now, consul serves a number of roles. It's kind of like Secretary of State meets the head of the FBI, meets Attorney General, and all kinds of things kind of woven into one, if we were to compare it to modern politics. Boethius was not only meant to serve as a counsel to the rulers, but he himself would be sent as an ambassador or as a judge over certain disputes. He would have to investigate things. One of the first events, if not the first event, that Boethius had to investigate during his tenure was, for example, the issue of the paymaster, who was charged, or at least alleged, to have debased the currency. Now, debasing the currency is a bit hard to understand right now. Often we talk about a debased currency as somehow losing its buying power, because, of course, we've transitioned to paper money or non-precious metals. But in this day and age, of course, gold and silver and other precious metals were the currency. And it was often the case that you had a mixture of a precious metal with a non-precious metal. And by and large, there was a certain balance to this. But one of the things that greedy people could do if they held on to the money or if they had access to it is they could melt it down, take some of the gold for themselves, which is good because now it's unalloyed, and then remix the coins and remint them with a higher amount of the non-precious metal. It's effectively stealing. And so Boethius has to step in and weigh this case out and determine if the paymaster had done this or not. Well, by all accounts, Boethius had a relatively happy life. His father had died at a certain age, though we don't know exactly when, and Boethius had been adopted or somewhat taken in by a man by the name of Symmachus. And for what we know of the relationship, Symmachus was a loving and a doting father figure for the orphan Boethius. Boethius actually ends up marrying Symmachus' daughter, Rusticiana, and they seem to have been happy. Boethius was serving in the high ranks of government, and he now married the daughter of his adopted father. And the two of them had two of their own sons, one named after their grandfather, Symmachus, and the other Boethius. Of course, they don't use the name Junior in this day and age, but Boethius named his second son after himself. Well, as can be expected, Boethius pressed for his sons when they came of age to join their father in the task of the statecraft of the politics of the day. And so in 522, both sons of Boethius are made consuls themselves. And by this point, Boethius is so well respected that he becomes Magister Officiorum, which means that he is the head of all government and court services for the kingdom. Well, at this time, the man on the throne was Theodoric. And Theodoric has a bit of a checkered past. Theodoric is actually the illegitimate son of Theodomir, one of the main lights in the Ostrogothic family of the Amali. And Theodoric did not have a good life. As part of the tense negotiations between the lineage of Constantine and the Ostrogothic kingdoms, Theodoric was actually given as a hostage in a sign of good faith to the court of Constans. And he is treated relatively well. He's educated, and he is sort of ingrained into the Constantinian line. And the goal here, of course, is very ancient. This is very typical for kingdoms sort of side by side, is you share children, they're raised in the foreign court, and the idea is that they develop some sort of loyalty to that court, so that when they return, when they come of age, they don't then muster an army and go to war. With Theodoric, though, he is the sometimes enemy, sometimes friend of the Constantinian line. And he gains something of the character of Theodoric by the way that he rose to power. In 41, the emperor, Zeno in this time, named Theodoric the Patricus and Magister Militum. That is to say, he is in charge of the military, and he is sort of a lead rank official within the court. In 44, he himself is appointed consul. But what Theodoric does is he sets out to overthrow Odoacer. And Odoacer, of course, is the sort of infamous figure who had deposed the last Western Roman emperor. And Theodoric wants to take him out. And by and large, Theodoric has the upper hand. He defeats Odoacer in 3 successive stages, and eventually he has Odoacer holed up in the city of Ravenna. And he manages to force Odoacer's surrender in 493. And he does so by promising life and liberty and something like house arrest for Odoacer if he gave himself up. And Odoacer does just this, and Theodoric says, you know what, I think I want to kill you. And he has him murdered. And as a result, Theodoric claims to be the restorer and now the head of the Western Empire. Well, if we return to Boethius, this is the court that Boethius is serving. And there are all kinds of tensions here that we can just sort of note. First and foremost is that Theodoric seems to be a bit of a loose cannon. He's somewhat unpredictable. If you're in his way, he's going to take you out, frankly. But more importantly, there is significant tension between East and West. Constantine's sons and the lineage from the Constantine line had not done the best job of keeping the West together. They had done a much better job in the East, and of course the reigns of all kinds of various lines and lineages and dynasties in the regions of Byzantium would continue on for centuries. The West was more of a fractious lot, though. And so whenever the issue of rejoining East and West comes up, very often this is considered hostile, treasonous in a manner of speaking. Well, suddenly, after all of this high tide of Boethius's life, adopted, married, and children, and rising up the ranks, suddenly in 523, he's thrown into prison by Theodoric. And the backstory to this is a bit murky. We're not actually quite sure of all of the ins and outs that happened here. We do know that several years before, in 520, Boethius did contribute somewhat to discussions about the reunification of East and West. And we really can only guess at his intentions if he did in fact do this. Perhaps it's the case that Theodoric and the Western rulers are no real match for the glories of old Rome. And so maybe there's some lurking suspicion that reunification and a restoration of the Byzantium lines might actually be better over the West. Now, we don't know if that's what Boethius did or if that's what he thought. But for whatever reason, in 523, he's thrown into prison in the city of Pavia. And the story of his arrest is pretty simple, though again, we don't know all the details. There was a meeting of the royal council in the city of Verona at the time, and a man by the name of Cyprianus actually accused a relatively minor figure by the name of Albinus of conspiring with Justin I out east. Boethius, during this, hears these allegations, and he jumps up to offer what he thinks is a rather logical conclusion, which is he says, if this man, Albinus, has done this, then so have I, he says. Now, he doesn't mean that he actually has done this. He's doing a bit of a reductio ad absurdum, which is to say he takes a conclusion that's being offered and he runs it to its logical conclusion and shows how crazy this is. What he's saying is, if you're going to accuse Albinus of doing this, you're going to have to accuse me and, frankly, a number of others of doing this simply because having any interaction with the East should not be taken as treasonous. There is some evidence, though, that this is a setup, because when Boethius offers this argument, suddenly Cyprianus produces a witness who corroborates the idea that Boethius somehow had some hand in a conspiracy between East and West. Now, again, we don't know all of the ins and outs here. We don't know if this is true. We don't know if this is trumped up, which was not uncommon in this day and age. And the problem of determining exactly what happened is made more murky by the allegations that happen on Boethius' behalf after he is thrown into prison. Generations after, he is reported to have been a strong defender of Nicaea and therefore serving under Theodoric, who was an Arian. He was part of the Ostrogothic kingdoms who were predominantly Arian. For Boethius to be Nicene and yet be a part of the Arian kingdoms meant that he was subject to this type of whimsical justice. That is more unlikely. And other allegations are made about Boethius here and there. He's accused of astrology, which is considered to be a sacrilege. Though, again, this is very unlikely that this is some issue that's lurking there in the government, that suddenly they find out that he is studying the stars and they find him sort of a misfit theological rebel. More likely is the case that Boethius' privileged place as part of an historic family, as well as his intellectual gifts, somehow set him at odds against those in the court, and eventually at odds with Theodoric himself. And whatever the case, in 523, he is thrown into prison in Pavia, and then a year later, in 524, he is executed. Now, all of this backstory would be interesting in and of itself, sort of the East-West split, the Ostrogothic kingdoms, etc. But the importance of Boethius is not so much his context, but what the context produced in him while he was in prison. Because while he was in prison, Boethius had little else to do but think and to reflect on the calamitous fortune of his life. Seemingly overnight, he went from a happy, married man with successful sons and him at the top of government to now being imprisoned, and of course he knows his life is going to be taken at any moment. And Boethius sits down and he writes Consolation of Philosophy. And now that you know the backstory, the title should make a lot more sense. What he's doing in this book is he is seeking a consolation for his soul and for the anguish he's going through by churning to the intellectual life. In a manner of speaking, this book is a theological example of the book of Job. Boethius' main question is, what in the world happened? I serve Christ, I love him, God is on the throne, and yet here I sit in prison. And the Consolation of Philosophy has as its sort of central conceit the idea that the good life has collapsed all around him, and as he cries out, the personification of philosophy or wisdom comes to him. And so right away we can say that the book has sort of a unique tone to it. Prior to Boethius, no one had ever decided to personify a virtue. Now, philosophy, to be clear, is not philosophy as we might use the word today. Philosophy in this day and age is not antithetical to what we might call theological thinking. So when he has the personification of Lady Philosophy in the book, he's not somehow being anti-Christian. This is one of the myths that's out there. In particular, historians who don't really care all that much for theological thinking or for church history tend to downplay the theological ideas in Boethius. And there's some arguments that are made, usually without a shred of evidence, that Boethius is some sort of pagan philosopher that was sort of warmed over, and his Christianity was really not all that strong. Okay, so what is Boethius' take on all of this? Well, when we're talking about the issues of predestination, God's knowledge of events, his sovereignty over all things that occur in this life, at root, always, in these discussions historically, is the problem of evil. That is to say, the issues of simply bearing out philosophy or categories or mere jargon is really never the issue at stake when people are discussing the issue of predestination. This is absolutely on display in the life of Boethius. He wants to discuss the issue, frankly, of why he, a servant of the Lord, is left in prison and he knows his life is soon to be forfeit. Well, Boethius takes on these issues in a new way that actually sets the tone and the pace for all of these discussions in the Middle Ages, and even after the Middle Ages. Boethius really looks at two issues. First of all, he asks the more emotional question, which is, if God is all-powerful, and he is the goal of all those who serve him, the knowledge of him and the love of him, then the question is, why do the wicked prosper? Why is it that the good are cast down and in prison? Well, Boethius' answer is pretty common, and frankly, it's pretty biblical. He begins with the conception that those who are prospering, if they appear to be wicked, are only prospering contrary to their appearance. That is to say, it's from our vantage, from our immediate experiences, that we even begin to think that the wicked are prospering in the first place. So Boethius begins with this fundamental position that from the vantage of God, that from his perspective, good is reigning. His sovereignty makes sure that what is happening is not the ultimate vindication, the ultimate victory of the evil over the good. So that's the first issue that Boethius lands on. Well, what about the more fundamental issue of how God is controlling evil events? Is he actually intending that they happen? Is he sort of pushing the button when evil happens to his people? Is he, in a manner of speaking, causing it in the fundamental direct sense? Well, the long history of the church's reflection on this is a bit complex, but it really comes down to a couple of different positions. The vast majority of people throughout history have tried to come up with language, albeit human language, drawn from the scriptures, though, in which they say that God is somehow over the events of this world, even evil events. He's not shocked, he's not asleep at the wheel, he's not powerless to stop them in the ultimate sense of that word. But theologians, for centuries, almost unanimously, have stressed that God is not somehow the cause of evil actions. And there's lots of strategies for doing this. Depends on the vocabulary, depends on the language that the person is speaking, frankly. One of the more common ways in modern English, for example, to say this is that God allows things to happen, but he does not cause them. Others have said that he is the formal cause of all that happens, but he's not the direct cause of all that happens. And that's a more complex way of saying that, yes, he's sovereign over everything, but he's not the one who is, in a manner of speaking, dropping the nuclear bomb himself. So you can see there's all kinds of strategies that people employ to say that God is in charge, but he's not the direct cause of evil itself. In other words, the move, biblically, is to say that God is not powerless, that he is God, but that he is, ethically, we might say, not to blame for the evil of this world. Well, we're not going to deal with this in the modern concepts of it or the modern vocabulary of it, but we're going to look at Boethius. Well, where does Boethius land? Well, Boethius picks up from some of the things that Augustine had said prior, and he puts his own unique spin on these things. He applies his own vocabulary. Augustine, in his writings against the Pelagians, had stressed that God foreknows all things that are going to come about. He also stressed, again, very typically, that God does not cause all things to happen in the sense of the puppeteer making everything that happens dance on his strings in the immediate sense. And for Augustine, he does describe God as being outside of time, but the aggregate of what he says essentially places God at the beginning of time outside of time. Now, be careful here. He doesn't actually say this in this specific way. Rather, the tone of the way Augustine approaches this subject is he talks about God being outside of time in eternity past, that he foreknew what we were going to choose, and that his foreknowledge is a matter of foreseeing the result of our choices. And Augustine argues that, in a manner of speaking, we are free to choose. We are choosing the things we love, even if they're evil, even if they're wrong. There is an element in which God is not making us sin, if you want to put it that way. But because God is outside of time, Augustine says, he sort of set the cast. He knew exactly what was going to happen, and he chose all the things that he wanted to have happen based on his foreknowledge of how we would respond. Now, as Augustine gets older in his life and more mature, and as his writings against the Pelagians grow more firm, Augustine will double down more strongly on the subject of predestination, sensing as he does that part of the Pelagian issue is the issue of the freedom, so to speak, of the will. If our will is freely choosing good or evil, Augustine stresses that we have to be careful in this, that we're not saying that we are saving ourselves. And so he begins to stress increasingly the predestinarian language as his writings mature on the subject. Well, notice again, when Augustine is dealing with the subject, he's dealing with it primarily in the concepts of the issues of salvation. Boethius is dealing with this in a somewhat different way. For Boethius, the subject, the question, is if God is somehow knowledgeable of all things that are going to happen before they happen, well, how can he, to put it existentially, have an emotional stake in what's happening? Let's just put it simply. If God is somehow knowledgeable of all that's going to happen, and the Bible tells us that he grieves when calamity befalls his people, or that he is righteously indignant whenever sin happens, whenever evil seems for a time to be reigning. Well, what Boethius is concerned about is that really more of a farce? Is God really expressing his emotional life, that he is opposed to sin, and that he grieves with his people? In other words, this is a fundamentally pastoral problem. If someone loses a loved one, if someone comes down with a chronic illness, a life-threatening illness, the question is, how can we say that God is emotionally invested if too much of our weight is placed on the idea that God knew what was going to happen? Well, for Boethius, the answer, the simple answer, he says, though the way he puts it isn't always simple, is that God is outside of time, but the stress he lays is that God is not outside of time in the way that Augustine had described it. For Boethius, the description of God outside of time, in a manner of speaking, in eternity past, prior to all the events that occur in the timeline, is insufficient as a way of describing God's sovereignty and his detachment from time. In other words, for Boethius, what he realizes is that if all we describe God as being is outside of time before time begins, the problem, the result, is that during the span of time when time is existing, it seems as if God is just kind of watching it happen in the same way that we're watching it happen. It might be like if we lined up a row of, thousands of dominoes. We laid them all out ourselves. We knew exactly where they were going to be. And then we hit the first domino and away it goes. Well, in the Augustinian way of describing it, God is a bit like us watching those dominoes fall. He knew they were going to happen, and so it seems somewhat disingenuous to say that when something happens along the way of the dominoes falling, that God is either happy or displeased or something like this because this is occurring. To put it simply, you set the plan up. You set the dominoes up, God. So why are you describing frustration or grief or an emotional state to us as your people if this is how you ordered all the events? Well, for Boethius, he actually comes up with a rather compelling understanding of the way God is related to time. Boethius argues that God is outside of time, but he's outside of the time, you might say, above time itself. It's not just that he is outside of time before time even begins. Rather, if a being like God is outside of time to begin with, that means that he is not subject to the emotional vicissitudes, the ups and downs, the highs and lows of the way these things are occurring as we experience them. In other words, what Boethius says is that if God is outside of time, then everything that occurs to him when it's happening is in, to use some jargony words, a state of eternal presence before God. In other words, God doesn't experience past, present, and future the way you and I experience it. Rather, whenever something is happening, Boethius would argue, it is, in a manner of speaking, present to him at that given moment. And Boethius actually gives an analogy for this. He says that God watches all of time, every moment of time, the way we might experience a race, a chariot race, actually, Boethius says. If it's a compelling race, an exciting race, our emotional state gets kind of wrapped up in the moment. We can express euphoria, we can cheer for the winner, or we can be dismayed and grumpy that our guy didn't win. Now, Boethius is clear that this is just an analogy. He's not saying that this is somehow peering into the knowledge of God in that fundamental sense. But rather, what he is stressing is that God is experiencing everything that occurs in a state of eternal presence. So he can, in other words, be both outside of time, sovereign over it, having foreseen and in some ways predestined all that shall come to pass, and yet also be radically emotionally tied in to the moments as we experience them ourselves. God is outside of time. He's not subject to it. But the very position of him being outside of time means that he is also able to express the intimate grief and loss whenever his loved ones experience tragedy. And he can also experience frustration and describe himself as being frustrated whenever sin, let's say the sins of Israel, seem to rise up to the surface and dominate for a period of time. Now, laying aside the philosophy of this, whether or not we buy into this or whether or not this is just some great simple description of the way that Boethius is trying to understand these issues, you have to appreciate the pastoral implications of what he's trying to say. What he's trying to say is that God is intimate with us, that when he describes grief for sin, when the Spirit is convicting us, and when we feel as if God is tenderly caring for us in the midst of our pain, Boethius wants to say God is not faking that. It's not some sort of emotional sleight of hand. It's not, to put a modern spin on it, the way we might fake an emotional response to something that our toddler has done, where we clap our hands and pretend as if we're really excited for this, when in fact we may just be simply doing this for their own sake. Boethius wants to say that God is actually experiencing things in a direct sense, an emotional sense, and that he does actually care for us. But he realizes that to make God subject to the vicissitudes of life, the ups and downs, is to go down a path that's unbiblical, because God repeatedly reminds us that his ways are higher than our ways, and that he was there from the beginning, and that he is the creator and the sustainer of this world, and not subject to all the capriciousness of the creatures and our sin and the ways in which we go about our lives. For Boethius, God is not causing all things in the direct sense. He's not the puppeteer pulling all the strings at once. He wants to, like so many other theologians throughout the centuries, say that God is both sovereign over it. He has somehow chosen all that shall come to pass. He has foreseen it. He has predestined it, whatever language you want to use. He is sovereign. But the key issue for Boethius is, how does God love us, particularly when times are tough for us? Do we see God as the robot, the great puppeteer in the sky? You knew this was going to happen. How dare you, God? And I see these places, say in the Psalms, where you tell us about the grief and how you identify with us, how you're our shepherd. Do we see these things as fake, or do we see them as somehow really and vitally part of God's experience with us? And so Boethius comes up with a bit of a both-and argument, you might say. And in the end, you can see in this part of the reason why Boethius is a bit of the last patristic man, the last man to stand in that biblicist early centuries of the church, in which so many people were concerned about articulating their philosophy and their theology with a real conviction. And yet you can also see why Boethius is called the first scholastic, the first man to really wrestle in a dialectical way, a systematic way, with some of the categories that he had inherited from the ancient church and from the scriptures. And even if we don't like his answer, even if you find some problems with it, we should at least appreciate the consolation of philosophy and its desire pastorally to answer the question, how can God be in control and yet also love us at the same time?